You will immediately know just by looking at Cultist Simulator if it is a game for you. It is one of the most mechanically banal yet utterly compelling experiences I've had with a video game in a long while. I tend to go in and out of simulation games regularly to flex my creative gaming muscles. City builders, management tycoons, and even sports sims are all games that hit that sweet spot for me when I need to wind down and find something to play just to pass the time. I think this is partially the reason why Cultist Simulator appeals to me as much as it does, but not the entire one. Because don't let the name of the game fool you, this really isn't a simulation game per se. While Cultist Simulator has a lot of shared elements with other sim games, it is far more esoteric than what you may perhaps be used to. In fact, calling Cultist Simulator a simulation game is itself a bit of a misnomer. There are traces of life simulation and basic corporate management structures to be found in the game, but that doesn't do a good enough job to describe what the game actually is. The game's own website refers to it as a narrative crafting digital card game, which is technically true, but there's far more to be found here. While the focus is mainly deck building, there are hints of roguelite elements with a heavy emphasis on the light, and the crafting is done in a more indirect sense. And all of that's wrapped up in written dialogue that is simply sublime, and that is really the true highlight of this entire experience. All of that comes together to make Cultist Simulator a game that is wonderfully addictive, provided that you're part of the right audience for it. Because, let's be realistic, Cultist Simulator is not a game for everyone. Cultist Simulator was developed by Weather Factory, a studio that was founded by Alexis Kennedy. And if that name rings a bell to you, it's probably because he helped found the company Fail Better Games and was the lead writer for both Fallen London and Sunless Sea. And anybody who's played either of those two games will immediately know that their star attraction is the sheer strength of their writing. They are some very, very well written games. And Kennedy brings that with him to Cultist Simulator, offering an experience that is just as, if not even more captivating.
The words contain knowledge. Now I contain it. It is a little like theft, and a little like feasting, and a little like the progress of an infectious disease. Sometimes, I've dreamt of a tall woman in a sand-colored coat who stands at the foot of my bed, smiling as she watches me sleep. In that dream, she turns her head with the swiftness of a bird, and her fingers flex like talons. I do not think I dreamt of her last night. If I had, I could not have slept so soundly.
At its core, Cultist Simulator is a game all about uncovering lore and the deeper mysteries of the occult. Everything presented to you is a vague riddle, but there's just enough information given to you to seduce you into digging deeper for that eldritch knowledge that is just out of your grasp. And the way you do that is so deceptively simple on its surface that I legitimately have a fear that many people will discard this game for no other reason than it looks boring. And I think that's a real shame because I honestly feel that where this game lacks in mechanical complexity, it more than makes up for with grade A storytelling. So here's how the game generally works. On a table before you are a number of cards and tokens. The cards represent pretty much any variable that you will come across. These run the gambit from your general statistics counters, which include reason, health, passion, and wealth, the objects that you gain, locations, people, and bits of arcane lore that you've uncovered over the course of your exploits. You use these objects by placing them within a number of different square tokens, each of which is a different verb, such as study, talk, explore, and work. By doing this, you can complete various actions, which then provide a number of different outcomes depending on what cards were used where, and after waiting for a timer to count down to find out what happens. The main aim of the game is to use these cards and verbs to build your cult, upgrade your desires, and ultimately win the game while fending off a number of different failure states. The real fun in the game comes from trying to precisely figure out what those token card combinations actually do, and that's what the game actively encourages. Some of the rewards are set, and the same action will always result in the same reward. Others offer random rewards, and that's where those aforementioned roguelite elements come into play. These rewards are often daisy-chained together with multiple verbs in order to accomplish greater and greater tasks, especially as completing those actions gives you more and more options at your disposal. Experimentation is the name of the game here. Think of the game as a giant chemistry set, and your job is to figure out what chemicals you can make by mixing certain ingredients with certain reagents, and you keep doing that until you come up with a recipe to create that final elixir that lets you win the game. This is what I mean when I say that the game offers crafting, but in an indirect sense, because it's not exactly crafting the way it comes to mind when you think of other similar games. And that's because that end goal is going to require a lot of trial and error to figure out. That's because you will die a lot in this game, make no mistake about that. It's just as easy to go insane in this game as it is to starve to death or plummet into a suicidal depression. There are a lot of dangers just waiting to consume you as you build your cult, and it's no small feat to circumvent them. To make things even more challenging, many of the cards you need to accomplish those tasks that you're doing won't permanently remain in play. A lot of cards are on timers, and once that number counts down, the cards decay and are removed from play entirely. This forces you to either try and recreate the cards if you know how to, or hope that you get them as a random reward for doing some other action. It adds a level of tension to the game that is otherwise just about moving cards around on a table, since this forces you to prioritize your actions. Do you want to hold on to that expiring vitality card to stave off illness? Or do you want to grind out a few more in time to increase your health? These decisions can quite easily make or break an entire run. But this general scope of gameplay also creates what is probably the game's single biggest weakness, and that is that it loses a lot of its mystique in forcing this repetition. You could only read the same text blurb so many times before reading it becomes tedious, and constantly dying and restarting has you reading the same text boxes over and over again in the early game very often. At some point, I just found myself clicking away without even reading many of the text boxes because I'd already seen them so many times before, and I just want to move on with the game. It sort of leads to a sense of NES syndrome wherein you become intimately familiar with the early stages of a video game by the sheer fact that you've just seen it way more than you do the later stages. And that's something that really holds Cultist Simulator back a fair bit. This isn't helped by the fact that any direction that the game offers you is minimal at best. Vague clues and cryptic hints are the only sort of tutorial that you'll get going into Cultist Simulator, mostly because it prides itself on being a game about experimentation. You're not totally left in the dark because every card does offer a bracketed off section that does tell you in plain English, that is, instructions that aren't written in purple prose, and that tells you what a particular card can do. But that doesn't mean that the game goes out of its way to define those actions for you. They're still cryptic enough to force you to keep experimenting, and frankly, I think that's much better for the whole experience. The game's strength is that of using well-written dialogue to create a sense of mystery to keep you going down that road of experimentation. In a way, Cultist Simulator is actually using its mechanics to replicate the same kind of eldritch mystery that your character is uncovering through their studies, albeit on a meta level, but that's a topic for another time. Also, it's never really fun to see a run that you have lined up suddenly get wiped out because you didn't realize that the cards you were generating were being sucked up by negative status conditions that you lost track of, and then your death feels like it happened out of sheer random chance. But the thing about that is, when you stop to realize that those deaths serve to teach you a lesson about gameplay, you begin to pay attention to the whole board and you make better use of your resources. Losing may not be fun, but at no point does the game ever feel unfair, and I think that's one of the most important distinctions to make. Especially because after every death, the game actively tells you what the mistake you made was which caused you to lose. It's just that those deaths tend to water down what makes everything else about the game so good, because they happen so frequently. And really, Cultist Simulator doesn't have the most compelling of gameplay on the surface of it. Playing a single-player card game isn't exactly the high point of gripping action. You really need to be someone who has a taste for games that are slower paced, or is really into games that are more esoteric in nature. But with that being said, if you allow Cultist Simulator to sink its hooks into you, those hooks run deep and they are hard to remove. It really does offer an addicting experience. The game manages to execute on its strengths so well and make itself so compelling to play that at one point when I was capturing footage, I kept telling myself that I'll quit after a couple more minutes, only to find that the light in my room had faded as the sun set, and I was sitting in near total darkness because I couldn't peel my eyes away from the monitor. Once you get into the groove of things, you'll find yourself getting into a consistent rhythm of placing cards onto verb tokens without skipping a beat. Slowly but surely, the veil opens up and you start to get a glimpse into the inner workings of the game. You begin to memorize patterns and know exactly how to accomplish what you want to. And I've only scratched the surface on this one. I cannot wait to go back and play even more. I want to finish building my cult, and I want to hit that level of ascension. And that's really the beauty of the game here. Cultist Simulator is not a game that's going to be universally appealing. But then again, Weather Factory already knows this. It requires that high level of trial and error to get the most out of it, and that's the crux of where most of the potential frustration with it will come from. It's slow and it's very boring to watch, but to play it is like cracking open a favorite novel and letting the honey of the words seep into you as you get lost in the pages. You really need to have a lot of patience to get the most out of Cultist Simulator, and if you go into the game with an open mind, an empty cup that's willing to be filled with the nectar of the unknowable, then I urge you to drink from the waters of Cultist Simulator as well. It is such a joy to play because it is packaged together so well and it makes the most out of all of its systems. And despite its flaws, it still manages to overcome them on a general level. When you tell yourself that you're only going to play a game for 5 more minutes, and those 5 minutes turn into hours in the blink of an eye, then you know you must be playing something special, and that game must really be doing something right.